In 2007, a family in Ohio gets approved for a mortgage on a house they can't actually afford. No proof of income required. No real check on whether they could ever pay it back. This wasn't a mistake. It was the plan. And by the time it unraveled, it wouldn't just cost that family their house. It would erase over $2 trillion from the global economy and put tens of millions of people worldwide out of work within a single year. To understand how something this big happened, you have to go back further than 2007 to the early 2000s, when interest rates were cut sharply to keep the economy moving after the dot-com crash. Borrowing became cheap. Really cheap. And when borrowing is cheap, people buy houses. Demand went up, prices went up, and for the first time in decades, banks realized there was an enormous amount of money to be made in mortgages if they could just find enough people to lend to. The problem was, they'd already lent to everyone who could reasonably qualify. So they started lending to everyone else too. Here's the part almost nobody explains properly. The crisis didn't start with a bank going bankrupt. It started with an idea that sounded almost boring. Bundle thousands of mortgages together into one giant investment and sell slices of it to investors. It's called a mortgage-backed security, and on paper, it makes sense. Spread the risk across enough loans, and one family defaulting barely matters. The problem is what happened next. Banks realized that if you could bundle mortgages regardless of quality, you could make more money by writing more mortgages, regardless of whether the people receiving them could actually pay them back. So lending standards didn't just slip, they collapsed on purpose. These became known as subprime mortgages, loans given to people who, under any reasonable standard, shouldn't have qualified. And the banks writing them didn't care because they weren't planning to hold onto the risk. They were planning to sell it, in pieces, to someone else, within days. Then came the part that turned a bad idea into a catastrophe. Ratings agencies, the companies whose entire job is to assess how risky an investment is, started stamping these bundles of subprime mortgages with AAA ratings, the highest possible safety rating, the same rating given to U.S. government bonds. Pension funds, insurance companies, and retirement accounts around the world bought these bundles believing they were as safe as it gets, because the people whose job it was to check didn't. And it went a layer deeper still. On top of these mortgage bundles, banks built something called credit default swaps, essentially insurance policies you could buy against a bundle failing, except you didn't need to actually own the bundle to buy the insurance on it. Which meant when the mortgages inside started failing, it wasn't just homeowners and banks losing money. It was every single institution that had bet on the outcome, whether or not they'd ever been anywhere near an actual house. Underneath all of it sat leverage. Banks borrowing $30, sometimes $40 for every $1 they actually owned, betting that housing prices would keep climbing forever. For a while they did. Then, in 2007, they didn't. Home prices started falling. Homeowners who'd been approved for loans they couldn't afford started defaulting, first by the thousands, then by the millions. Suddenly, those AAA-rated bundles weren't worth anywhere near what anyone had paid for them, and every bank holding them was sitting on losses nobody had priced in. A small number of investors had actually looked closely at the mortgage data itself instead of trusting the ratings, realized the whole system was built on loans that were never going to be repaid, and quietly bet against it. When the collapse came, they were among the only people who saw it coming, because almost everyone else in the system had simply chosen to trust the label rather than check what was underneath it. This is where the psychology takes over from the math, because everyone in the system knew, on some level, that this couldn't last forever. Traders knew it. Executives knew it. Even some of the ratings agencies privately knew it. But nobody stopped, because stopping first meant losing money while your competitors kept making it. It's a version of herd behavior economists call a greater fool mindset. You don't need to believe the price is fair. You just need to believe someone else will pay more for it than you did. Then, in September of 2008, Lehman Brothers, one of the largest investment banks in the world, collapsed in a single weekend. And because that bank was tangled into thousands of contracts with almost every other major financial institution on Earth, its failure didn't stay contained. It set off a chain reaction across banks, pension funds, and entire countries, Because in a system this interconnected, one institution's collapse becomes everyone's problem within hours. Credit markets froze almost overnight. Businesses that relied on short-term loans just to make payroll suddenly couldn't get them at any price because no bank trusted any other bank enough to lend. Stock markets around the world lost trillions of dollars in value within weeks. And this is the part that often gets lost in the noise of Wall Street headlines. None of this stayed confined to banks. Ordinary people lost retirement savings that had nothing to do with subprime mortgages, simply because those savings were invested in markets that were collapsing under the weight of a crisis they never took part in. Governments stepped in with unprecedented bailouts, not because those banks deserved saving, but because letting them fail risked taking the entire global economy down with them, a dynamic that became known as too big to fail, which meant the people who built this, who wrote the bad loans, who stamped the false ratings, who bet borrowed money on prices rising forever, mostly walked away employed. The people who lost their homes did not. In the years afterward, new regulations were written specifically to try to prevent a repeat. Tighter rules on how much banks can borrow, closer oversight of exactly the kind of bundled mortgage products that started all of this. Whether they'd actually hold up under the same pressure again is something nobody can fully answer until they're tested by a crisis just as severe. None of this required a conspiracy. It required a system where nearly everyone's individual incentive was to keep the music playing, and nobody's personal cost for stopping first ever outweighed the cost of losing the race while everyone else kept going.